One of the topics that doesn't seem to get a lot of attention when it comes to the Second World War is the use of cavalry by the Soviet Union. And there's a great book called Soviet Cavalry Operations During the Second World War by John S. Harrell. It's a really great book. And so I'm just going to kind of give a quick overview and what my thoughts are on it. Now, when most people think of the cavalry during the Second World War, they think of it being completely obsolete, not being used, and really the only example that comes to mind is the Polish cavalry charging German panzers during the invasion in this suicidal attack. Pretty much every other major combatant in the war had this same idea that the horse cavalry was obsolete and that it was pretty much suicidal to use horses on the modern battlefield. There are a few examples, like the Americans using cavalry during the Battle of the Philippines in early 1942. Um, there are the Germans had a cavalry division early on in the war, and then shortly after the invasion of the Soviet Union, this cavalry division was quickly converted into a panzer division. You also have the American First Cavalry Division, which essentially became an infantry division, all but in name. They kept the name, and then the formalities. The battalions were called squadrons, companies were called troops. So it was essentially an infantry division. So if all these other countries came to the realization that the cavalry was obsolete at this point in history, why was it that the Soviets continued to use cavalry? Well, there are a couple reasons, and number one being would be necessity. At the beginning of the war, the Soviets suffered huge losses in pretty much every category, and especially in tanks. The T-34, one of the most famous tanks of the war, a lot of people like to argue that it's the best tank of the war. It was a good tank. I wouldn't say it was the best, but at that point in 1941, it wasn't available in large numbers. And then the tanks that the Soviets did have, many of them had been knocked out very, very early on. So it was really just out of necessity. They needed some mobile force, and the only thing that they really had access to at that point that could do the job reliably was the cavalry. There was also an issue with the infamous purges that happened in the 1930s. The military, the Soviet military, the high command, the colonels, the generals, the higher ranking officers suffered horribly, where many of them, a great, I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but a great number of them were either killed or imprisoned. This was especially true in the armored corps. The many of the leading pioneers in Soviet tank doctrine were either executed or imprisoned. Their ideas were discarded. This wasn't so much the case in the cavalry. Many of the officers retained their position. I believe Stalin himself was actually in the cavalry, so that might have played into it. So at the beginning of the war, the tank commanders lacked experience, but in the cavalry arm, you had many competent commanders that still retained their position. There was also an issue of the terrain and the climate. There are many areas in Eastern Europe and Russia where it's heavily forested. There are marshy areas, swamps where tanks simply can't go, vehicles simply can't go. Cavalry can. And then there's also the issue of climate. Uh, Obviously, during the winter, it was incredibly cold, is incredibly cold. Vehicles, tanks, machinery of all kind has difficulty operating in that environment, but horses were able to continue moving, continue fighting. So that was a huge advantage during the winter of 1941 and 42. How the cavalry was actually used in battle probably differs to how people perceive it. A lot of people have this image of these suicidal charges that the Polish cavalry made against the German panzers, or that, suicidal charges that the Russians would have made. Um, Now, that did happen on rare occasions, and when it did happen, it usually was disastrous. As you can imagine, cavalry charging across an open field against dug-in infantry with automatic weapons, it's pretty much a suicidal charge. But that's not really how the Soviets used their cavalry. They used them kind of as a combination of mounted infantry, as scouts, and as raiding parties. They would obviously ride to a certain location, dismount, and then engage in combat on foot. They would do scouting, and then also they would use their cavalry forces as raiding parties. And this was largely influenced, to a great deal, it was influenced by the American Civil War. Russian officers were studied, commanders like Jeb Stuart of the American Civil War, these fast-moving raiding parties. And this helped to influence the Soviet deep battle doctrine, and then eventually the operational maneuver group. The deep battle doctrine was basically like a giant kind of like the Soviets' version of blitzkrieg. You break through the enemy's lines, you rapidly advance into his rear, you disrupt his communications and his supply route. Here are some pretty interesting photos. You have Soviet cavalry, sorry, the light is reflecting off it, but you have Soviet cavalry charging across open fields. Now, like I said, this probably didn't happen. These are probably staged photos. This did happen. When it did, it normally didn't turn out very well unless the units they were charging were already broken and retreating. This is probably more of what it would have looked like. Scouting, dismounting, dismounting your horses in wooded areas, and then moving it on foot. And there's also the fact that they brought along their own support. They had machine gunners. These are the Russian Maxim machine guns that they had mounted. So they had automatic support. They had their own artillery that they carried with them. So it wasn't just guys on horses with guns and sabers. They had heavier weapons that they brought with them as well. So why did the Soviets eventually do away with the horse cavalry by the end of the war? And the short answer is basically they didn't need them anymore. Soviet industry had made up for the losses at the beginning of the war. They were producing more and more tanks. They were also getting supplies through the Lend-Lease from America and from the UK. They were getting tanks, which that wasn't the main contribution. They were getting supply trucks and jeeps and other vehicles like that, which greatly increased the mobility of the Red Army. So at the end of the war, there was really no need to have the cavalry anymore. They had served their purpose, they had filled that gap when they needed to, and they did their job. So there was basically no more need for them.